The child was taken in the night. No ceremony, no blessing, no warning. Only the thunder of boots across the rusted plates of the hive and the guttural roar of a vox-amplified order as arbitrators drove the chosen into the open. They were not told why, only that resistance meant death and obedience meant a chance at something beyond the filth and ash. In that grim darkness, chance was as precious as air. The boy's name had already begun to fade. His mother screamed as they tore him from the hab block, her voice a ragged whisper swallowed by the sound of gunmetal doors slamming shut. He was small, like the rest, little more than a half-starved husk. But the recruiters did not care for weakness or strength in the way ordinary men measured it. They looked for a spark buried beneath the grime, something half-hidden, something that could be sharpened into a blade. For him and the others dragged into the waiting transports, there was no comfort in that thought, only fear, churning and suffocating, as the hive disappeared behind walls of plasteel and silence. The journey was long, a blur of void black tunnels and the rattling hum of engines. In the darkness, the boys pressed together, wide-eyed and trembling. Some whispered prayers to the Emperor, their words clumsy but desperate, clutching at the only thing left that felt like safety. Others stayed silent, teeth clenched against the rising terror. One child vomited from the stench of unwashed bodies and recycled air, and the sound set off a ripple of weeping. No one comforted them. Comfort belonged to another life. When at last the doors hissed open, they were herded into light so blinding that it stabbed at their eyes. The world they stepped into was not theirs. It smelled of burning oil and sanctified incense, the air heavy with a metallic tang that bit the tongue. Towers of black stone rose into the fog, crowned with the sigils of the chapter, stern and merciless. The recruits were marched through gates that seemed to breathe menace, carved with the two-headed aquila that glared down as if judging each one of them. None of the boys spoke now. They understood without words that they had entered a place where voices did not matter. The first test came swiftly. No speeches were offered, no encouragement given. The children were driven into an arena of cracked stone, where older acolytes, already hardened by training, waited with blunt weapons. The message was simple: fight or be discarded. For many, it was the first time they had ever faced combat beyond the petty brawls of hive gangs. The clash was merciless. Bones broke beneath wooden staves, skin split open under fists and boots. The weak fell quickly, sobbing or unconscious, dragged away by silent servitors whose faces were nothing but pale masks of mutilation. The boy fought with nothing but instinct. His fists were small, his body fragile, but he refused to yield. When a strike split his lip and blood filled his mouth with iron, he spat it back onto the stone and lunged again. He was beaten down more than once, but each time he rose, trembling, teeth gritted. He did not win, but he did not surrender. And in that refusal, in that stubborn defiance, the apothecaries took note. For days that bled into weeks, the trials continued. They were tested in endurance, starved until their bellies shriveled, and then forced to run until their lungs screamed. They were left in freezing darkness, stripped of clothes and given nothing but silence, while hidden observers watched who broke first. They were made to scale walls slick with frost, to swim through water choked with filth, to fight until their hands blistered and their fingernails tore. Every test was a sieve, catching only those who clung to survival with the strength of desperation. The boy learned quickly. Hunger became his companion, pain his constant tutor. He stopped crying, stopped longing for the embrace of the mother he barely remembered. Each day was a narrowing tunnel, and at the end of it there was only survival. He began to notice the others less. Children who once huddled beside him were gone, their bunks empty, their names never spoken again. The silence of their absence was heavier than any sermon. There were moments of strange beauty amid the horror. On one rare night, when the drills paused and the recruits were left alone in their barracks, the boy stared out through the high windows. He saw stars for the first time, cold and innumerable, scattered across a black canvas. He wondered if those distant lights had seen the same sorrow in 1,000 other worlds. He wondered if the Emperor, in his golden radiance, could possibly look down on a child like him. The answer came in the form of a priest, his voice a jagged hymn carried on incense smoke. The man told them they were chosen, not by chance but by destiny, that each lash of pain was a gift, each moment of suffering a step toward becoming something greater. The priest spoke of the angels of death, warriors clad in ceramite who strode across battlefields as demigods. He told the boys they could be those angels. But his words, gilded in fire and faith, hid a truth none of them yet grasped, that for everyone who ascended, 100 would perish in darkness, unmarked, forgotten. The boy held on to the words anyway, not because he believed, but because belief was all he had left. The days became seasons, though the recruits were never told how much time had passed. In the windowless chambers of stone and steel, time was measured not by suns or moons, but by the sound of boots on flagstones, the rasp of a drill sergeant's breath, the crack of a lash when someone faltered. Sleep was granted in snatches, food in rations barely enough to sustain a body. The instructors did not wish to raise boys. They wished to strip away humanity until only iron remained. Those who could not endure were discarded without ceremony. The boy clung to survival with an animal's desperation. His body grew leaner, stronger, his skin marred with bruises and scars that never had time to fade before new ones were added. Hunger no longer brought him to tears. It sharpened him, honed his senses until the scrape of a boot across stone or the shallow breath of a rival in the barracks sounded like thunder. When the staff came down across his back, he did not cry out. He pressed his teeth together until they ached, until blood seeped from the inside of his mouth, and he endured. There were moments when he thought he would break. Once, after days without rest, he collapsed during a forced march. His knees slammed against the gravel and the world tilted into blackness. A boot dug into his ribs, and an apothecary loomed over him, silent behind a mask of bronze. The boy thought it was the end, that he would be dragged away like so many others. But the apothecary's gaze lingered, unreadable, and then the boot shifted just enough for him to stand again. He rose, every muscle screaming, and staggered forward. In that instant, he realized something cruel and undeniable. They were not testing his strength. They were testing his refusal to die. The arena trials returned, fiercer than before. The children who had survived this far were no longer fragile, trembling things. They had grown into predators, their eyes hard, their fists brutal. Each bout was no longer about who could endure the most pain, but about who could inflict it fastest, with the least hesitation. The boy learned to strike without mercy, to drive his knuckles into the soft places of the body, to seize a rival's wrist and snap it before the blow could land. Violence ceased to feel unnatural. It became the only language that mattered, and yet, in the stillness after the fighting, he felt something hollow gnawing inside him. He could no longer remember the faces of those who had fallen, or the sound of his mother's voice. Memory itself was being worn away, sanded down by exhaustion and fear. One night, as he lay awake in the barracks, he tried to recall his own name. It hovered just beyond reach, a soundless echo. He clenched his fists until the nails bit his palms, but the name would not return. In its absence, only the Emperor's name remained. It was then that he began to understand the truth of the trials. They were not shaping warriors. They were unmaking children. What emerged at the end would not be the same beings who had entered. One dawn, or what he thought was dawn, though the sky was hidden behind stone, he was summoned to the courtyard once more. The air was sharp with incense and the acrid tang of burned promethium. A chaplain stood before them, his Crozius arcanum held high, his skull-faced helm gleaming in the pale light. His voice thundered across the gathered recruits, every syllable a hammer blow. He spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of the Emperor's will carved into flesh and spirit alike. His words were fire, consuming doubt, branding the boys with faith. And then came the blooding. Servitors emerged from the shadows, carrying cages filled with beasts from some nightmare world. The creatures shrieked and clawed, their eyes red with hunger, their teeth dripping with venom. The recruits were handed blades, blunt, crude, nothing more than sharpened steel barely fit for slaughter. They were told to survive, nothing more. The cages opened. The boy did not think, for thought was death. He moved as the beast lunged, its jaws snapping inches from his throat. The stench of its breath was foul, hot with decay. He drove the blade upward, missing the heart but cutting deep into its side. Pain did not stop it. The beast roared, striking him across the chest with claws that tore flesh from bone. He staggered, blood running down his ribs, the world spinning. But something within him, something forged by weeks of torment, refused to yield. With a scream that was more instinct than voice, he hurled himself forward, driving the blade again and again into the creature's throat until its thrashing ceased. Days blurred again into nights, if nights could be counted in a place where no stars or moons pierced the fortress walls. The boy's body ached constantly, a map of half-healed wounds and fresh bruises, yet something inside him hardened. Where once he had trembled at the sound of servitors dragging away the fallen, now he no longer flinched. Fear had dulled into a kind of quiet resolve. He was still here. He was still alive. That was victory enough, the instructors noticed. Their eyes, hidden behind lenses and augmetics, lingered on him longer than before. He was not the strongest nor the fastest, but he endured with a doggedness that refused to be broken. Each time he staggered beneath exhaustion, he rose again. Each time blood blinded him, he wiped it away and pushed forward. It was not glory. It was survival stripped raw, a refusal written in flesh. One evening, the recruits were summoned to the cavernous hall beneath the monastery, a place where statues of armored giants towered above them, their visors staring down with eternal judgment. Candles burned in vast rows, their smoke curling up into a ceiling lost in shadow. A chaplain's voice filled the chamber, not with sermon but with accusation. He spoke of weakness as sin, of failure as betrayal, of the emperor's gaze watching every heartbeat. His words seared into them like brands. Those who faltered here would not simply die. They would die as traitors to the vision of the master of mankind. Then came the culling. The recruits were lined up, dozens of them, their faces pale in the candlelight. Apothecaries moved among them, their robes whispering, their surgical instruments gleaming. One by one, each child was measured, tested, examined. A gesture, a nod, and some were taken aside. They did not resist. They knew better than to ask. The boy's stomach clenched as the apothecary's gloved hands pressed against his ribs, traced the bones of his skull, studied the strength of his heartbeat. Seconds stretched into hours. Finally, a short nod, and the apothecary moved on. The boy exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He remained in the line. He was not among those dragged into the shadows. Later, he learned what happened to them. The whispers came from older acolytes, boys who had survived longer, their voices low and grim. Those deemed too weak, too flawed, too brittle for the emperor's design were not spared. Some were dissected, their bodies opened so the gene seed process might improve for those who came after. Others were turned into servitors, their minds stripped away, their flesh bound to iron, condemned to shuffle mindlessly through the fortress forever. To fail was not to be sent home. There was no home left. To fail was to be unmade. The knowledge burned in him like a fever. Failure was not an option. Not anymore. The next trial came without warning. The recruits were woken in the dead of night by klaxons, the air filled with crimson light. Instructors stormed the barracks, seizing them by their collars and dragging them out into the open. There, in the cold courtyard, they were handed weapons again, not blunted sticks this time, but live blades honed to an edge so sharp it gleamed even in the red glow. No words were spoken. The meaning was clear. Survival. The boy's heart hammered as the command was given. The recruits turned on each other, hesitation burned away by terror. The courtyard erupted into chaos, steel flashing, voices shrieking. The boy found himself face to face with another child, barely older than himself, his eyes wide with panic, blade trembling in his hand. For a moment, neither moved. Then instinct took hold. The boy struck first, the clash of steel ringing in his ears, sparks dancing where blades met. He fought not with skill, but with the fury of one who knew that hesitation meant death. The other boy faltered. The blade slid past his guard, biting deep. The child collapsed, eyes glassy, blood spilling across the stones. The boy froze, breath ragged, staring at what he had done. His first kill, the weight of it pressed on him, heavier than any trial before. Yet as the instructors watched from the shadows, he understood. This was what they wanted. Not boys, not children, weapons. By the time the trial ended, the courtyard was littered with bodies. Those who still stood were covered in blood. Some theirs, most not. The boy was among them, his blade slick, his chest heaving. Around him, silence stretched, broken only by the soft hiss of incense burners carried by priests. The chaplain's voice rose once more, declaring those who remained chosen. They had proven themselves willing to kill, willing to sever their past, willing to bleed for the Emperor's design. That night the boy lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, unable to close his eyes. Every time he did, he saw the face of the child he had killed. Not an enemy, not a heretic, not an orc or Xenos beast, just another boy who had wanted to live. He clenched his fists until his nails dug blood from his palms. He told himself it was the Emperor's will. He told himself it was survival. But the hollow ache in his chest did not fade. In the silence, he whispered the only prayer he knew, the only name he remembered. Emperor, do not let me be next. The fortress swallowed the boy whole. Days and nights ceased to exist, devoured by the relentless rhythm of trial and punishment. His body no longer felt like his own. Bruises healed too quickly, skin hardened, and bone ached as if it were being reforged from within. He was still only at the beginning, still mortal, still fragile, but already the shadow of something else loomed over him. The barracks had grown emptier. Cots once filled with the restless murmurs of children now lay stripped and silent. Each absence was a reminder, though no one dared speak of it. Those who asked questions did not last long. Better to keep one's head low, to endure, to let silence be the only companion. The boy had learned this lesson well. His lips rarely parted except for breath or prayer, and even prayer he carried in his chest, unspoken, lest someone mistake it for weakness. One morning, or what the instructors declared as morning, they were marched deep into the bowels of the fortress. The air grew colder as they descended, the light dimmer, the walls narrowing until the vastness of the upper halls felt like a dream. Here, in the underworld of stone and steel, the air was thick with the stench of chemicals and the sharp sting of antiseptic. Vox grills crackled overhead, spewing fragments of litanies that dissolved into static. The place felt less like a monastery and more like a tomb. They were brought into a chamber lined with iron cages. Inside them snarled beasts unlike anything the boy had ever seen, scaled, fanged, born of some nightmare wilderness. Their eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting hunger and fury. The recruits stiffened. Some shifted nervously, hands twitching toward their sides as though for weapons that were not there. An apothecary stepped forward, clad in white armor stained with fluids that would never wash away. His helm's vox grill amplified his voice into a guttural growl. He told them this was not a test of strength nor of skill, but of will, to face the impossible and not falter, to meet death with eyes unblinking. He gestured, and servitors dragged one of the cages open. The beast lunged, chained but furious, its roar filling the chamber. The first recruit was pushed forward. The boy watched as the child froze, trembling, then screamed as the beast tore him apart before the chains pulled it back. Blood pooled black on the cold stone. The apothecary did not react. He only called for the next. One by one, the recruits were sent forward. Some ran, some fought, some wept. Few survived more than a few breaths. The boy's turn came with terrifying swiftness. He was shoved forward, the beast's eyes locking onto him with predatory hunger. His body screamed to flee, but his legs carried him forward anyway. The air reeked of blood and wet fur, of iron and bile. The beast lunged. Its jaws snapped inches from his face, its claws carving sparks against the floor. He felt its hot breath, foul and suffocating, wash over him. His mind emptied. There was no thought, no memory, only the raw pulse of survival. He darted sideways, the chain clanging taut as the creature missed. He seized a jagged shard of stone from the floor, gripping it so tightly it cut into his palm. With a cry that was more desperation than courage, he drove it into the beast's eye. The creature howled, thrashing violently. Blood sprayed across his face, warm and metallic. The shard snapped, leaving him weaponless. The beast crashed against the chain, jaws snapping blindly, but the apothecary raised a gauntleted hand, and the servitors hauled it back into the cage. The boy stood trembling, drenched in gore, his chest heaving. Silence fell. Then slowly the apothecary nodded. Not approval, not praise, merely acknowledgement. The boy had not triumphed, but he had not faltered. That was enough. When he returned to the line, the eyes of the other recruits avoided his, not out of contempt, but out of fear. In surviving, he had become something different in their gaze, something set apart. He felt no pride in this, only exhaustion. That night, as he lay in his bunk, the screams of the torn and the dying echoed in his ears. He pressed his palms to his face, still sticky with dried blood, and whispered again to the silent dark, "Emperor, let me see tomorrow." The next phase of the trials began before the blood of the last ordeal had even dried. The recruits were roused from their bunks with the shriek of klaxons, the floor shuddering beneath their bare feet. Armed instructors drove them into the open with the flat of their staves, shouting orders that blurred into one long roar. There was no explanation, only command, and in this place command was everything. They were herded into a vast cavern, its ceiling lost to shadow, its walls dripping with condensation. Torches sputtered in iron brackets, casting jagged light across the stone. In the center lay a pit filled with mud thick as tar, stinking of rot and waste. The recruits were shoved inside, stumbling as the sludge swallowed their legs up to the knees. Then came the weight. Great stones, each heavier than a child's chest, placed into their arms. The order was clear: carry, endure, survive. Hours bled together. The mud sucked at their feet with every step, dragging them down. Muscles quivered, lungs burned, and backs screamed beneath the burden. One by one, children fell, their stones slipping into the muck. Servitors moved in silence, dragging the failed away, their faces already forgotten. The boy's arms shook violently, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he clutched his stone as though it were life itself. He stumbled, fell to one knee, but rose again, mud caked across his skin. There was no thought, no plan, only the singular drive not to be taken. At last, after what felt like eternity, a horn sounded. Those still standing, few now, fewer than ever, were pulled from the pit. The stones were taken from their arms, their weight replaced by the dull ache of muscles stretched beyond breaking. The boy collapsed onto the stone floor, every part of his body trembling. He did not know if this was victory or simply a reprieve before the next torment. He only knew he was still there. The reprieve was brief. That night they were lined up in silence, the instructors passing down the row with eyes like blades. They handed each recruit a thin shard of metal, little more than a needle. No words were spoken. But the silence was heavy with meaning. The boy stared at the shard in his palm. It gleamed faintly in the torchlight, cold and sharp. His stomach twisted. He knew what it meant. This was no test against beasts, no contest of strength. This was obedience. This was surrender. The chaplain emerged from the shadows, his crozius glowing faintly with sanctified power. His voice thundered across the hall, declaring that loyalty demanded sacrifice, that the emperor demanded blood freely given. Not a drop, not a token, but proof. Proof that pain was nothing before his will. One by one, the children pressed the shard into their flesh. Some drove it into their arms, others into their thighs, some into their hands. Blood dripped onto the floor, gleaming like black oil in the torchlight. The instructors watched with expressionless patience. When the boy's turn came, he did not hesitate. Hesitation was death. He lifted the shard, pressed it against his chest, and forced it deep enough to bite muscle. Pain erupted, sharp and searing, but he did not cry out. He gritted his teeth, breath hissing through clenched lips, and withdrew the shard slick with his own blood. The wound burned, warm rivulets soaking into his rags, but he stood tall. The chaplain's skull-helmed gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than the others. Then he raised his crozius and intoned a blessing, words that rang like iron bells in the cavern. The recruits had proven themselves willing to bleed, willing to surrender even their flesh for the emperor's cause. It was a victory carved in scars. That night the boy lay awake, staring at the wound seeping against his chest. His body trembled, but not from pain. From the dawning realization that his life no longer belonged to him. It belonged to something far greater, far more merciless. His blood was no longer his own, and in that moment he understood the truth. He was already dying. Not quickly, not in one moment of violence, but piece by piece, with every trial, every drop of blood spilled, every memory forgotten. What would remain at the end of it he did not know, but it would not be the boy who once had a name. Somewhere in the darkness, a hymn began, sung by unseen voices deep within the fortress walls. It was mournful, beautiful, and terrible all at once. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, the sound carrying him into uneasy sleep. The trials of the body were only beginning. The trials of the soul still waited beyond the horizon. The boy awoke to the sound of hymns. Not the gentle kind sung in crumbling shrines by weary priests, but a deafening chorus amplified through vox grills, each note a blade of iron that split the air. The words were in high Gothic, their meaning unclear, but the tone was unmistakable: reverence, awe, and dread. The recruits were marched single file into the apothecarian, their bare feet echoing on steel. The chamber smelled of blood and oil, of cauterized flesh and sanctified chemicals. White-robed figures moved with mechanical precision, their tools gleaming under sterile lumen strips. The walls were lined with iron tables, each one bound with shackles. The recruits slowed as they entered, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow. They knew, instinctively, that this was the place where they would be unmade. An apothecary in full armor stepped forward, his pauldrons marked with the sigils of the chapter. His voice, filtered through his helm, resonated like a cathedral bell. He told them that they stood on the edge of eternity, that the flesh they carried was unworthy, weak, impure, that the emperor demanded they be remade, cell by cell, organ by organ, until their humanity was burned away and replaced with something higher. He did not speak of mercy. He did not promise survival. He told them only the truth, that most of them would perish screaming on the cold iron of these tables, and those who did not would never again be who they once were. The boy's heart pounded as he was dragged to a table. Cold metal bit into his skin as clamps locked around his wrists and ankles. The apothecaries moved with no haste, no cruelty, only the efficient detachment of men who had performed this ritual countless times before. A mask descended over his face, the scent of chemicals flooding his lungs. His vision blurred, the world dissolving into fragments of light and shadow. He drifted between waking and darkness. Voices spoke around him, their words half heard, half dreamed. He felt something cut into his side, a sensation so sharp it seemed to split his soul. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the mask. The pain was unlike anything he had ever known, not the burn of lashes or the sting of blades, but a fire that reached into the marrow, rewriting him from within. His chest convulsed as a foreign weight was pressed into him, his body shuddering in rejection. The world blurred red. His heart stopped. For an endless moment there was only silence. Then it started again. He gasped, choking on air that seared his lungs. His vision swam with after-images of fire and light. He felt the thing inside him pulse, alien yet alive, beating in rhythm with his own failing heart. The apothecary said nothing. They moved on, preparing the next violation. The days that followed were a descent into torment. One by one the organs were implanted, the secondary heart, the osmodula to strengthen his bones, the biscopia to flood his muscles with unnatural growth. Each operation tore him apart and stitched him back together, leaving him fevered and delirious. His body swelled with new strength, but also with unbearable pain. At night, he lay in his bunk drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as if something monstrous clawed beneath his skin. Not all survived. The boy watched as others convulsed during implantation, their veins bursting, their bodies rejecting the emperor's gifts. Some screamed until their throats bled, begging for death. The servitors granted it swiftly, their surgical blades humming. The corpses were taken away, their faces covered, their names erased. No prayers were spoken. The failures were not mourned. They were forgotten. The boy endured. Each new organ threatened to break him, but somehow he held on. His blood boiled, his bones cracked, his skin split beneath the strain of growth. He clutched the edge of his cot until his knuckles bled, whispering the same prayer over and over, "Not yet." Emperor? Not yet. The most harrowing came with the implantation of the black carapace. The procedure was not just surgery, but a crucifixion. He was bound once more to the table, his chest carved open, the sacred interface plates driven beneath his skin. The agony was beyond comprehension, a raw tearing that seemed to strip away the last fragments of humanity he had clung to. He thrashed until his restraints cut into bone, his screams raw enough to shred his throat. In the haze of pain, he thought he saw the Emperor himself, not as the golden figure of shrines, but as a blazing sun that seared his soul. He did not know if it was vision or hallucination, mercy or madness. When it ended, he lay broken, his body trembling with every shallow breath. He felt the weight of the black carapace beneath his skin, a second flesh, alien and suffocating. He understood dimly that he had been given the means to merge with the armor of angels. But in that moment he felt no triumph, only emptiness. And yet he was alive. That night, as he lay in the infirmary surrounded by the moans of others who clung to life by a thread, he realized something terrible. He no longer feared death. He feared survival. For every day he endured, another piece of himself was stripped away. The boy with no name was vanishing piece by piece, organ by organ, replaced by something he did not recognize. Something that might not even be human. The trials of Flea. The weeks bled into one another, measured not in days but in surgeries, in fever, in the raw taste of copper at the back of the throat. The boy moved through a cycle of agony and fleeting reprieve, drifting in and out of a half-conscious haze where memories of his past life, the streets, the hunger, the sound of rain on rusted roofs, grew fainter with every cut of the apothecary's blade. He no longer knew how many times he had been opened, how many times his blood had been siphoned, recycled, replaced with fluids that burned like acid in his veins. What he did know was that his body was no longer his own. The change was visible even to his own fever-clouded eyes. His hands, once bony and frail, had thickened with muscle. His skin stretched tight across growing sinew. His jaw felt heavier, his chest broader. He caught glimpses of his reflection in polished steel trays. A stranger stared back at him, eyes sunken but alight with something alien. He wanted to scream at the mirror, to demand the boy he had been returned to him, but the voice that rasped from his throat sounded deeper, rougher, a growl more than a plea. Not every change brought strength. Some left him paralyzed for days, shivering as his body fought to knit itself around the foreign things lodged inside him. Once he awoke unable to breathe, his chest locked in an iron grip. The world shrank to a pinprick of light as he clawed helplessly at his ribs. Then with a sudden convulsion, his second heart kicked into rhythm, slamming blood through his veins with such force that he vomited crimson onto the floor. He lay gasping in his cot afterward, realizing that death had brushed close and the organ had dragged him back against his will. Others were not so fortunate. A boy he had once shared bread with on the streets did not survive the osmodula's transformation. His screams stretched for hours until his voice broke, leaving only the sound of cracking bone as his skeleton twisted and snapped from within. The apothecaries restrained him, their tools flashing in the light, but the body rejected the gift, and he died convulsing, limbs bent at impossible angles. The boy watched as the corpse was carried away, and though he tried to remember his friend's face, it slipped from his mind like sand through fingers. They were not meant to carry memories of the dead. One night he awoke to silence. The moans and cries of other initiates had ceased, leaving only the low hum of machinery. He rose shakily, his body still aching from the last implantation, and saw that half the cots were empty. The failures had been purged. Those who remained lay in restless sleep, twitching with fever dreams. The boy lay back down, staring at the ceiling, and felt an emptiness settle in his chest. He had survived again, and survival was beginning to feel like a curse. When consciousness allowed, the apothecaries forced them to train. Still weak, they were made to run drills, to lift weights until their new muscles screamed, to spar until the room stank of sweat and blood. Their bodies were tested relentlessly, every day designed to push them past the brink of collapse. The boy endured. He fell, he bled, he vomited from exhaustion, but each time he dragged himself upright again, not because he wanted to, but because he could not imagine the shame of failure. Death he no longer feared, but to fail, to be cast aside as unworthy after all he had endured, that was unbearable. The black carapace marked the final breaking. Even days after its implantation, the pain lingered, a constant burning beneath his skin. At night, he felt it pulse faintly, as if alive, as if waiting to drink in the power of armor he did not yet possess. Sometimes he thought he could hear it whispering in the dark, though he could not tell if it was the voice of the Emperor or simply madness gnawing at the edges of his mind. One evening, as the recruits were assembled in the training hall, the apothecary who had overseen their transformations stepped forward. His armor was the color of midnight, his helm a sculpted visage of death. He told them that they were no longer mere children, that those who still breathed had endured trials that had slain thousands before them. But his voice held no praise. He reminded them that this was not the end, but the beginning. They were no longer boys, but they were not yet Astartes. They were in between, cast adrift in the gulf between man and transhuman. And in that gulf, most would still drown. The boy stood among the survivors, chest heaving, muscles trembling from training. He felt the weight of the words settle into his bones. He had survived what should have killed him, endured agony beyond measure, but still he was nothing. Not man, not warrior, not angel, nothing. The transformation of flesh was not the end, but merely the threshold, and the boy discovered this truth in the months that followed. His body, now swollen with strength, was no longer his to command with ease. Every movement felt unfamiliar, as though he were a guest inhabiting another's form. When he clenched his fists, the power within them startled him. When he breathed, his chest expanded with such force that it seemed his ribs might split. He was a creature remade, but one who had yet to learn the language of his own sinew and bone. The training grew harsher with every passing day. No longer were the trials confined to the confines of the apothecarian or the fevered stillness of the cots. Now the recruits were driven into vast drill yards, the sky choked by the smoke of distant manufactorums, where they were ordered to march in precise formation for hours beneath the unblinking gaze of towering statues of the Emperor. Whips cracked, voices thundered, and the air itself seemed to press down upon them with the weight of eternity. The instructors were not gentle. Veteran warriors clad in ceramite observed their every movement, striking without hesitation when a recruit faltered. A boy stumbled under the weight of a bolter mock-up, its mass far heavier than any weapon they had ever touched before. Without a word, the instructor tore the weapon from his hands and drove its stock into his chest. The boy crumpled, choking blood. The others did not dare to look away, for hesitation was punished with equal savagery. The boy, nameless, faceless, forgotten by the world he had come from, found himself adapting in ways he did not understand. Muscles that had once screamed under strain now endured without pause. Reflexes sharpened. His body seemed to move before his thoughts could catch up. When sparring, he felt the strange organs within him flare to life, his secondary heart pounding like a war drum, flooding his limbs with energy that bordered on frenzy. His blows landed harder than he thought possible, and when struck, he recovered faster than the pain could overwhelm him. He began to realize that the suffering he had endured in the apothecarian was not cruelty without purpose. It had forged something monstrous in him, but there was no triumph. For every gain, there was a shadow. His memories of childhood dimmed further, as if his mind itself was discarding what was unnecessary. The sound of his mother's voice, once sharp in his thoughts, now slipped from him no matter how tightly he clung to it. The smell of rain, the taste of stolen bread, the names of those who had once fought beside him in the gutter. These details dissolved like smoke. He woke some nights with his hands clawing at his face, trying to remember who he had been, only to realize he no longer cared. Survival demanded forgetting. Not all of his brothers endured with the same resilience. During one grueling sparring session, a recruit's strength surged too quickly, his untested organs betraying him. His body seized, muscles knotting into spasms so violent that his bones tore free of their sockets. He collapsed, shrieking like a wounded animal, until an instructor ended his life with a single bolt pistol shot to the skull. The boy flinched at the sound, but not from pity. What haunted him was the cold finality with which the body was dragged away. No name was spoken, no prayer given, only silence. Every death hollowed the ranks further, but the instructors spoke of this thinning with indifference. It was necessary, they said. It was inevitable. To reach the armor of the Astartes, to stand as one of the emperor's chosen, required that only the strongest, the most relentless, remained. Mercy was not part of the equation. In the imperium of man, mercy was weakness, and weakness was death. And so the boy learned to kill the part of himself that wanted to grieve. He learned to step over corpses without pause, to eat the rations given without thought of those who starved beside him. He learned to swing his weapon with precision, to break bones without hesitation, to silence his own questions when doubt whispered in his ears. Day by day, the boy unraveled, and in his place, something new coiled itself into being. One night, lying on the cold stone of the dormitory floor, he pressed his palm to his chest and felt both his hearts beating in tandem. For the first time, he wondered if they belonged to him at all. The truth was simple, undeniable. They did not. His blood, his bones, his skin, his organs, every part of him was no longer his. He was a vessel, a weapon in the making, and the boy he had once been was already dead. And yet, as sleep dragged him into dreams where fire and shadow danced across the void, he realized that what terrified him most was not death, nor pain, nor even failure. It was the growing certainty that he was becoming what the apothecaries desired, not a boy, not a man, but a blade. And blades did not choose. They were wielded. The air of the training halls never smelled clean. It was a mixture of sweat, blood, and the acrid sting of oils used to maintain the practice weapons. Day after day, the recruits were pushed beyond the limits of endurance, their reshaped bodies honed into tools of war through repetition, exhaustion, and pain. The boy no longer counted hours. Only the rhythm of drills, the bark of orders, the crack of whips when a line faltered. He was stronger now, faster too, but with each improvement came new burdens. His appetite had grown ravenous, driven by the alien organs swelling inside him, and the thin rations provided barely dulled the hunger. At night, when others collapsed into fitful sleep, he lay awake with his stomach twisting like a pit of fire, his mind consumed by thoughts of meat, of blood, of sustenance he could not name. More than once he caught himself eyeing his fellow recruits with something darker than camaraderie, and each time he buried the impulse beneath whispered prayers to the emperor. But the hunger always returned. The instructors noticed every flaw, every hesitation. During one sparring session, the boy's reflex faltered for the briefest instant. His opponent's blade struck his shoulder, a shallow wound that would have felled him in his old life but now barely slowed him. Still, the error was enough. The instructor descended on him like a predator, gauntleted fist driving into his gut with such force that he collapsed to the sand, gasping for air. He was forced to his feet, ordered to resume, and only when he bled freely from lip and brow did the bout end. No comfort was given. The lesson was simple. Mistakes were paid for in pain. Sleep brought no respite. His dreams were a battlefield of their own, filled with flashes of memory and visions he could not explain. He dreamed of towering figures in golden armor striding through endless halls of light, of a throne that blazed like the heart of a sun. At times, he dreamed of his own death, again and again, his chest bursting, his throat torn open, his body consumed in fire. He would awaken drenched in sweat, his secondary heart hammering, unsure if the visions were madness or fragments of truth implanted by the apothecary's rituals. More recruits fell. One during live fire exercises, when his body could not withstand the recoil of the heavy bolter. Another during endurance trials, when the heat of the training furnace withered his organs into failure. The boy watched their bodies carried away with the same cold silence as always, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer saw tragedy in their deaths, only inevitability. It frightened him how quickly compassion had been scoured from him, as if it too had been carved out with the scalpel. And yet, not all was despair. There were moments, brief, fleeting, when he felt the raw power in his limbs and marveled at what he had become. During one drill, he lifted a steel plate that no normal man could have budged. holding it aloft as the instructors looked on. His arms trembled, but they did not fail. In that moment, pride flickered within him, fragile but undeniable. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine standing in the armor he had glimpsed in murals, to imagine himself as one of those angels of death who strode across the stars. But pride was dangerous, and the universe had ways of extinguishing it. The very next day, a recruit he had fought beside since the earliest trials collapsed mid-run. His skin blistered, his veins blackened, and his body convulsed until it burst in a spray of blood and bile. The apothecary said nothing. They dragged the corpse away, leaving only the stain on the sand as reminder. The boy stared at it, his fleeting pride shriveling to ash. Strength was never a guarantee. Survival was never promised. Even the mightiest organ, the hardest bone, could betray them in an instant. The lesson cut deeper than any blade. He was not his own master. His fate belonged to the emperor, to the chapter, to the cold hands of the apothecaries who shaped him. And if they deemed him unworthy, if his body faltered even once, then he would be discarded without ceremony, his brief spark of existence extinguished as if it had never been. That night, as the dormitory settled into uneasy silence, the boy pressed his forehead to the cold stone floor. He whispered words he did not fully understand, prayers half-remembered from the streets, now reshaped in desperation. Do not let me fail. Do not let me be forgotten. Let me serve. Let me endure. But even as he prayed, he felt the emptiness in his chest where his old self had been. The boy was gone. What remained was something forged, something sharpened, something that did not yet have a name. The seasons of torment blurred together until time itself lost meaning. There was no morning, no night, only the cycle of training, of pain, of brief moments of rest that felt more like death than sleep. The boy's world was reduced to the clang of steel, the rasp of his own breath, and the voices of his masters, always demanding, never satisfied. His body had become a battlefield where man warred with machine, flesh with the alien gifts stitched into him. He no longer flinched when bones cracked or when flesh split under the strain of exertion. His wounds closed faster now, his skin knitting itself with unnatural speed, the memories of pain already fading before the blood dried. But with this strength came unease. He would sometimes press his palm to the new muscles of his arm, or the ridges forming along his ribs, and wonder if there was anything of the boy left at all. One day, they were taken beyond the walls of the fortress monastery into the ash wastes that stretched like a dead ocean across the horizon. The sky was a choking gray, the air heavy with the scent of promethium and dust. Here they were made to march for days without food, their only water drawn from canisters filled with bitter liquid that tasted of rust and chemicals. Their instructors carried no mercy in their eyes. Those who fell behind were beaten until they stood or left where they lay, the waste swallowing them without a word. The boy endured. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but each time he faltered, the second heart within him roared to life, flooding him with a tide of strength. He hated it, hated the way it reminded him that even his survival was not his own, but he used it all the same. Each step became a prayer, not to live, not to rest, but simply to keep moving. When night came, they slept in the dust beneath the hollow stars. The boy lay staring at the sky, trying to count the pinpricks of light before they blurred into a haze. Somewhere out there, beyond the void, wars raged in the Emperor's name. Somewhere, warriors wearing the same sigils as the instructors cut down entire armies, their bolters roaring, their armor unbroken. The boy wondered if he would ever see those distant stars as anything other than cold light. The trials in the wastes broke many. Some succumbed to exhaustion, collapsing face first into the dust, their bodies too spent to rise. Others fell into madness, clawing at their own flesh as if trying to rip the alien organs free. One boy staggered to his knees beside him, sobbing, begging for release. An instructor obliged with a bolt round through the head, the sound echoing across the barren plain. The others did not pause. They marched on, boots crunching over the corpse without hesitation. On the final day, as the recruits staggered back toward the looming fortress, Their bodies caked in ash and blood, the instructors announced that half had been lost. Their tone carried no grief, only calculation, as if they were tallying a ledger. Those who remained were not praised, for endurance was expected. But the boy understood something then, something that settled into him like cold iron. Survival itself was the test. Each breath he drew was not his own, but a measure of his worth in the eyes of the Emperor. When he lay down that night, his body aching, his mind empty, he realized with a clarity that chilled him. He no longer wished for escape. The idea of returning to the streets, to hunger, to the weakness of his old life was unthinkable. He had been broken and rebuilt too many times. Whatever he had once been was gone, and what he was becoming could only move forward. To falter now was not to die. It was to betray everything he had already endured. He closed his eyes, listening to the twin hearts thrum in his chest. Not in rhythm with each other, but in rhythm with something greater, something vast and unyielding. And for the first time, he did not pray to survive. He prayed to be worthy. The fortress swallowed them once more, its gates closing like the jaws of some vast predator. Within its stone heart, the trials only deepened. The boy and what few recruits remained were herded into chambers that smelled of old blood and machine oil, places where the line between training hall and torture chamber blurred. Here, they were tested in ways that went beyond endurance of body. They were forced to fight in darkness, the only illumination the occasional flash of a lumen strike that seared the eyes and left after-images burned into vision. Shapes moved unseen in the black, blunted blades cutting through the air, fists striking from nowhere. The boy learned quickly not to trust his eyes, but the sharpened senses that the alien organs within him had begun to awaken. He could hear the rasp of another's breath, smell the tang of their sweat, feel the shift of air before a strike. He bled often, but less than before, and in time his movements grew sure, instinctual, animal. Other trials were stranger still. They were made to drink alchemical brews that twisted their stomachs into knots and burned through their veins like fire. Some collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Others convulsed until their spines arched and snapped. Those who survived found their vision sharpened, their reflexes honed to a razor's edge, but at the cost of nights racked with fever dreams. The boy saw visions of gold and fire, of a vast throne surrounded by shadows, of a voice that whispered without words. Sometimes he woke screaming, unable to tell if the voice was a blessing or a curse. The instructors watched all with the same unflinching detachment. They offered no explanations, no assurances. To falter was to fail, and to fail was to die. That was the only truth the recruits were given. Friendship had long since withered among them. Once, in the earliest days, there had been whispered conversations in the dark, shared prayers, stolen glances of sympathy when another suffered. Now there was only silence, each recruit locked in his own battle, each knowing that to cling too tightly to another was to invite grief. The boy no longer sought companionship. He had forgotten the names of those around him, their voices blurred into a chorus of grunts and cries. They were not brothers yet, only rivals on the knife's edge of survival. Still, there were moments, rare, fleeting, when he felt something stir within him that was not pain, nor fear, nor hunger. During one sparring bout, he caught sight of himself reflected in the helm of an instructor. For an instant, he did not see the boy who had come from the streets. He saw something larger, harder, a figure that might one day stride into war clad in armor that bore the mark of his chapter. The thought filled him with a fire that no pain could extinguish. It was not hope, not exactly. It was inevitability, whispered from deep within his bones. Endure, and you will become. But the fortress did not let such thoughts grow unchallenged. The next trial drove them into the catacombs beneath the monastery, where the air was thick with dust and the walls echoed with distant, unearthly sounds. Each recruit was given only a knife and told to descend. No guidance, no warning. The boy felt the dark close around him as he moved deeper, the silence broken by the scraping of unseen claws and the hiss of breath not his own. What hunted them in those tunnels was never named. It was small, swift, and merciless. Screams rang out in the dark, cut short as something dragged bodies away. The boy's every nerve burned, every instinct sharpened. He fought not with skill, but with desperation, his blade flashing in the black as he struck at movements too fast to see. When the silence finally fell, he stood alone, blood slick on his hands, his chest heaving. The knife dripped with ichor that steamed where it touched the stone. When he emerged, only a fraction of the recruits returned with him. Their eyes were hollow, their hands trembling, but they were alive. The instructors looked upon them without expression. Survival was not reward, it was expectation. That night, lying once more on the cold stone floor, the boy pressed his blood-stained hands together and whispered another prayer. Not for deliverance, not even for strength, but for the will to remain unbroken until the end. For he understood now with certainty, every trial, every cut, every nightmare was not meant to test his body. It was meant to strip away the last remnants of humanity until nothing remained but the weapon the Emperor demanded. And the boy knew, though he feared to name it, that he was nearly ready to surrender what little of himself was left. The apothecaries and instructors had broken their bodies, and the wastes had stripped their humanity. Yet the next ordeal was subtler, more insidious, and in its own way more unbearable. The fortress did not rest content with flesh alone. To become Astartes was to surrender the mind as well, and so the trials turned inward. The boy and his surviving kin were herded into the librarium vaults, though no books lined the walls. Instead, the chamber was filled with machinery, iron thrones threaded with cables, cogitators humming with quiet menace, servo-skulls drifting like vultures in silence. The smell of incense hung heavy, masking the sharper stench of chemicals and burnt ozone. One by one, the recruits were strapped into the thrones, their skulls fitted with cold metal circlets, needles pricking into skin, wires burrowing toward thought. When it was his turn, the boy felt the world tilt as the machine sank its claws into his mind. At first there was only pain, a blinding white fire that tore through memory and sense alike. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed, lost in the static roar of vox chant that filled the vault. Then came the voices, thousands of them, speaking in tongues he could not understand, whispering fragments of scripture, threats, prayers, and lies. They crowded his skull until he thought it might split apart. The machine forced images into him, visions that crashed like waves against his consciousness. He saw worlds burning, alien beasts tearing men apart, titans of iron striding through firestorms. He saw himself standing among them, clad in armor that gleamed like midnight, bolter in hand, his every step shaking the earth. But as quickly as it came, the vision shifted, twisted, until he saw himself consumed by fire, his body broken, his name forgotten, nothing but ash carried on the void. The tests were not meant to inspire, they were meant to unravel. Memory by memory, the boy was forced to relive his past, the hunger of his childhood, the fear of the alleys, the nights spent trembling beneath the cold stars. The machine amplified his failures, made him feel every lash of shame, every moment of weakness, until he wept with rage at the boy he had once been. But even as it broke him, it offered temptation. Whispers spoke of escape, of surrender, of laying down the burden and embracing oblivion. It would be easier, they promised. So much easier. Yet something within him clung stubbornly to the pain. He remembered the trials of flesh, the wastes, the brothers who had fallen and been forgotten. If he surrendered now, he would join them, nameless and erased. He would not endure all this only to vanish like smoke. Gritting his teeth, he resisted the voices, even as they grew louder, more insistent, promising him relief. When at last the machine released him, he slumped in the throne, drenched in sweat, his throat raw from screams he barely remembered making. The apothecaries looked upon him with their blank lenses and said nothing. Success was not praised, only failure was punished. But the trials did not end there. In the days that followed, the recruits were drilled not only in body but in creed. They were forced to recite the catechisms of hate, to chant litanies until their voices broke, to kneel for hours before statues of the emperor without food or water. If one faltered, all were beaten. If one misremembered a line, the lash fell until blood soaked the stone. The fortress would permit no cracks in faith. And Astartes was not merely a weapon of flesh and steel, but of belief, sharpened into fanatic edge. The boy found it harder than he had expected. His mind rebelled at times, whispering doubts in the quiet between drills. He remembered the silence of the wastes, the emptiness of prayers unanswered, and wondered if the emperor had ever heard him at all. But he did not dare give voice to such thoughts. He forced himself to recite, to bow, to kneel, to bury doubt beneath obedience. For doubt was death, and death without purpose was worse than any pain the apothecaries could inflict. Yet as the weeks passed, he noticed something terrifying. The words he spoke, once empty sounds on his tongue, began to sink into him. When he whispered the emperor's name, he felt a weight in his chest, a fire that spread through his veins. When he recited the litanies, his doubts grew fainter, buried beneath the rhythm of prayer. Whether this was faith or indoctrination, he could not tell. All he knew was that the boy he had once been, the boy who stole bread, who wept in the alleys, who prayed for deliverance, was gone. In his place stood something harder, colder, a mind forged into weapon as surely as his body had been. And though he feared the emptiness where his past had been, he also feared what he was becoming less and less. For each day, each chant, each trial brought him closer to the inevitable truth. He was no longer surviving for himself. He was surviving for war. The nights in the fortress grew stranger after the trials of the mind began. Sleep no longer offered rest, but became yet another battlefield. When the boy closed his eyes, he was seized by dreams not wholly his own. Some nights he stood upon mountains of bone, his skin aflame yet unburnt, while titanic shadows clashed above him, their weapons sundering sky and stone alike. Other nights he found himself walking the echoing halls of the fortress alone. Though the statues seemed alive, their stone eyes tracking his every step, their lips moving as if whispering litanies too quiet to hear. At first, he thought these visions mere fragments of the machine's torments lingering in his mind, but he soon realized that all the recruits shared them. Whispers spread among them in hushed tones when the overseers were absent. Some claimed the dreams were the emperor's touch, his way of searing truth into their souls. Others muttered that they were no more than tests, conjured phantoms to measure obedience. A few, broken by sleeplessness, wept and begged for the visions to end. None of them were spared. The boy endured as best he could, though he sometimes woke with his fingernails clawed bloody against the stone floor, or his teeth aching from grinding against themselves through the night. In those moments, he remembered the machine's whispers, the promises of surrender, and he felt their shadow linger. But even then, he clung to the faint embers of defiance, telling himself that if these were tests, he would not break. The fortress continued to grind them down with ceaseless rigor. Food was rationed to the point of near starvation, just enough to sustain breath and motion. Lessons in combat blurred into lessons in faith, as if both were one and the same. They were told that to hesitate in battle was to blaspheme, that to question an order was heresy, that mercy was a word belonging only to the weak and the alien. Instructors barked such truths until their throats bled raw, and when their voices faltered, the crack of whips spoke for them. Yet there were moments, brief, fleeting, dangerous, when the boy sensed the hollowness in it all. One dusk, after endless hours of chanting before the shrine, he caught the eye of another recruit. The boy was younger, his lips trembling as he mouthed the prayers, his gaze darting toward the lash in the overseer's hand. For an instant, their eyes met, and the boy recognized the same silent question that haunted his own heart. Was this truly faith, or merely fear in disguise? He tore his gaze away at once, for to dwell upon such thoughts was to invite death. Still the question lingered, buried beneath obedience like a knife hidden in the dark. In the days that followed, more recruits began to falter. Some collapsed mid-prayer, their bodies racked by exhaustion. Others broke entirely, screaming curses at the statues, tearing at their own flesh in madness. The fortress showed no mercy. Such souls were dragged from the halls by silent servitors, their fate unspoken but understood. None who were taken returned. The boy did not know why he endured where others failed. He only knew that each trial carved more of him away, until he felt hollowed, like a vessel being emptied in preparation for some unseen purpose. The memories of his old life became faint, blurred shadows receding further each day. Faces he once loved no longer stirred grief. Even his own name began to sound strange when whispered in the dark. And yet beneath it all something endured. A thread of self, fraying but unbroken. He could not say if it was stubbornness or hatred or some faint spark of will that refused to be extinguished. But he clung to it as he clung to breath, for without it, he feared, there would be nothing left at all. The instructors called it progress. They said the recruits were being remade, their weakness flensed away, their minds honed into blades of devotion. Perhaps they were right. But as the boy knelt before the statue of the emperor that night, whispering the litany until his lips cracked and bled, he wondered quietly what it meant to be a blade. For blades had no voice, no will of their own. They cut where they were driven. They broke when their purpose ended. And in that silence, with blood on his lips and doubt burning like a hidden ember in his chest, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. He was beginning to want it. The indoctrination deepened until it was no longer confined to waking hours. One evening, after a day of relentless drills and recitations, the boy was taken with a handful of others to a chamber below the fortress that reeked of sacred oils and coppery blood. The walls were carved with shifting murals that seemed to move in the torchlight, scenes of war and triumph etched in a style so intricate that the eyes could not rest on them without losing focus. At the center stood a circle of robed figures, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their hands clasping censers that spewed thick coils of incense. The recruits were ordered to kneel. As the smoke filled the chamber, the boy's lungs burned and his vision blurred. The chanting began low, a guttural rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Slowly, steadily, it grew louder, until it drowned out thought. Until the only sound in existence was the relentless drum of prayer. He felt himself sinking, not into sleep, but into something deeper. A trance, a drowning in sound and smoke. Images surged in his mind once more, though this time they did not come from machines. He saw endless legions of warriors clad in ceramite, their banners snapping in storms of fire. He saw himself among them, faceless, his identity swallowed by the thunderous unity of their march. He saw alien hordes broken beneath their tread, planets burning in the Emperor's name. The visions were not gentle. They were brutal, unrelenting, hammered into his mind like nails into wood. He tried to resist, to cling to the thread of self he had preserved. But the smoke and chanting pressed harder, erasing, rewriting, reshaping. He could feel the boy he had once been, hungry, afraid, trembling in the wastes, slipping further away, dissolving into the tide of devotion. And yet, amid the storm, he felt a strange calm. For the first time, the agony of survival did not rest solely upon his shoulders. There was a purpose greater than himself, vast and terrible, but certain. He did not need to choose his path. It had already been chosen. When the ritual ended, he collapsed against the stone, trembling, drenched in sweat. The robed figures said nothing. They simply moved on to the next group, as if the transformation of a soul was no more remarkable than the sharpening of a blade. In the days that followed, the boy noticed changes in himself. The litanies came easier now, the words flowing from his lips with less effort. His doubts, once sharp and piercing, now felt distant, muffled, like whispers behind a wall. The visions in his dreams no longer terrified him, but left him with a grim determination, a hunger to become the warrior he had seen. Even his pain, once unbearable, began to feel like proof of progress. He was not alone in this shift. The other recruits moved with a new rhythm, their faces harder, their eyes colder. They no longer flinched at the lash, no longer wept when one of their number was taken away. They had begun to accept the fortress's lessons, or perhaps the fortress had succeeded in hollowing them enough that acceptance no longer mattered. But though his doubts grew quieter, they did not vanish entirely. Sometimes, in the brief silence before sleep, he would remember the gaze of the younger boy who had faltered in prayer, the unspoken question in his eyes. He would remember the fleeting spark of recognition that passed between them, and he would wonder if the thread of self he still clung to was truly strength, or if it was weakness waiting to be cut away. Still, he endured. He prayed when told to pray, fought when told to fight, and buried his questions where no overseer could ever see them. For if he had learned anything in the crucible of the mind, it was that survival did not always mean resistance. Sometimes survival meant surrendering just enough to remain standing, and so he surrendered, piece by piece, even as he told himself he had not.